Hi everyone, this is AJ, and for those of you who missed the color theory presentation, I'm going to do it right here. And here we go. So a little bit about me. I owned a dye house in Miami. I made a lot of tie-dye and dyed fabric. Color theory for fabric is just a little bit different of how we make the color as opposed to painting a color or printing a color. So I'm going to explain to you how when you're in the dye house and you want to dye your fabric of how we set up the color wheel. It's a little bit different than if you're painting. So the first thing we have to do is we go into the dye house and we have 3 vats of color, and we have a vat of red dye, yellow dye, and blue dye. And these are called our primary colors. And all colors, whether you're painting or not, all start with this. We then need to start mixing the dyes together to make secondary colors. So we mix 50% of the red dye with 50% of the yellow dye and we get orange. And we mix 50% of the yellow with 50% of blue and we get green. And we mix the blue dye now 50% and 50% with the red dye and we get violet. So now we have 6 colors, and these are our secondary colors. But we want more color. So now we're going to change the ratio of how we mix them to make the 3rd tier of colors, which are tertiary colors. So we go back to the dye house, and now we take the red dye and we mix a lot of red dye with a little bit of yellow and we get red orange. Then we mix a lot of yellow dye with a little bit of red dye and we get orange yellow. We do the same. We take now a lot of yellow dye and we mix it with the blue dye and we get yellow green, which most people call lime. And then we take a lot of blue dye and mix it with a little yellow dye and we get blue green, and this is what we would consider to be aqua. And then we take a lot of the blue dye and mix it with a little bit of red dye and we get blue violet, or most people call that purple. And then we take a lot of red dye and mix it with a little blue dye and we get red violet, and that would be similar to like magenta. So now we have 12 colors on the color wheel, and this we just made our tertiary colors. But this outer ring of color, in the fabric world we call these the brights or jewel tones. So we then divide the color wheel into warm colors and cool colors. So color does 2 things. It moves the eye differently among the quilt, as well as it evokes emotion. So warm colors, which are our magentas, reds, oranges, and yellows, we get feelings of like love and passion and anger or excitement or heat. Or the yellows, we think of sunshine and happiness. So colors many times evoke emotion. But what the warm colors do in design aspect is they bring the objects forward on the plane. So it's the first thing that the viewer eye will see. So warm colors bring your eye to the front of the front plane. Here's an example of a quilt only in warm colors, and you can feel that this quilt looks a little hot or heated or aggressive because it has the reds in it. It's all on the warms. To me, it looks like almost like fire. Now we have the cool colors. So the cool colors are our purples, our blues, and our greens. And they too evoke emotions. They make us feel calm. We think of coolness, we think of water, we think of relaxing, we think of tranquil, we think of health because of the green, we think of the outdoors. But they also serve a purpose, and cool colors fall into the background and makes your eye move back, so it recedes to the back. So here's an example of an artist who used navy as her darkest blue of her cool palette, and all cool colors, and you can see that this quilt makes you think of sleepy and calmness and night. It has a very different effect than the red one. This quilt artist, she's from the UK, only works in the jewel tone range, and she only stitches in she quilts in stitch in the ditch, or she ties them down in specific places because she doesn't want the stitching to interfere. And Alexandra only uses, like I said, the bright colors in her work. You can look her up. But you can see how she used the brights strategically, or the hot colors, the warm colors strategically, so they pop first. It's the first thing that you see on the quilt. And then she has her blues and her purples around it, so the rest of it calms down and recedes back. So check her out because she uses the jewel tones and really can make her a lot of excitement in her quilts with just using a jewel palette. Now here's one, it looks like a landscape and your eye goes right to that yellow and you think of like a sunset or a sunburst. You think of sky. And then on the bottom, it's all the shades of blue, so it gives a feeling of calmness, almost like water. Here's another one. This artist just started to veer into the cools with her background. You could see some of the more purpley reds in there, but you could see on the front that she has the warm colors and they pop forward, and then the background, which are a little bit more tonal, but they're getting cooler, recedes way back. This is another one. I think this is from the Michigan Modern Quilt Guild, and you can see how they take almost like a rainbow and they start with no color of white into the yellows, into the oranges, into the reds, the warm colors, and then they start mixing into the purple and the cooler colors, and you can see that the bottom of the quilt has a much different effect than the top of the quilt because the color is doing that. It's making our eye look differently. So on the color wheel, we have what's called complementary colors, and that's exactly what's opposite. So why would you do something that would be opposite? Well, when you have a quilt that's you're saying, you know, it's just not popping, it looks kind of dull, I'm not exactly sure what color to look at. You go to the color wheel, you pick the color that you have, your predominant color, and you go right across the color wheel and you pick its opposite. And usually it will work. So we've all seen Michelle Wilkie's quilt where she has the blue and the aqua. Her quilt is quite tonal, and then she goes right across and pops it with that orange. And the reason also why it works is that the orange is the same weight as the blue next to it. So also when you're working with color, the intensity of the color also has to be considered. Here's another one of all the warm tones, and they go right across. They decide to take the yellow and go right across and hit that purple in there, and you can see that it really changes and brightens up the quilt. Now this woman actually named her quilt Complementary, and she took all of the shades of blues and she went right across and picked the orange and balanced it very well, and it's an opposite color, but it creates excitement on the quilt. So now we decide we really don't want our jewel tones all the time, so we go back to the dye house and we take our vats of dye and we dilute them with water. And when we do that, we get a range called midtones. And in the fashion and fabric world, we don't like to call them midtones. We usually call them sorbets, sherbets, or frosted pastels. But you can call them midtones. If we were printing our fabric, we would call this a half tone. So now we have an entire range of color that works the same way as the outer ring. And you can also interchange between them. But we want another set of color, and we would have pastels. And that would be just adding more water to the dye vat, and that's where we get, you know, the baby colors, the baby blue, the baby pink, those softer colors. If we were painting, that inner ring would actually look different because we would be mixing it with a complementary color, and that would be called what we do creating a hue. But in fabric world, we don't have hues because you would just end up with muddy colors. So in the fabric world, we tend to have 3 to 4 shades from the original color. So here's just an example of using a pastel range, and this quilt would probably look just as lovely if they used it all in midtones or all in brights. And here's another one, and you can imagine that if this was all in brights, it would look just as nice, or if in the midtones. So when you have fabric that's also in the same range of weight, of intensity of color, they work as well. So here's just some other terms. So a tint is when you add white when you're painting. In the dye house, we would be adding water. A shade is when you add black. And we don't tend to add black too much in the dye house because things get a little dirty looking. And a tone is when you add gray. And this is something we definitely do in fabric dyeing. Sometimes we just want to add gray. And you'll always say sometimes a color, and you'll say it has a little gray tone to it. It's a little bit more muddied. So gray tends to stay a little bit cleaner in the dye bath. So color harmonies. This is going to help you when you're sitting there with all these solid color fabrics and you want to make a solid colored quilt. It'll also help you if you have prints, but in general, if you ever wanted to make that solid quilt and didn't know where to start, you would look, these are tried and true color harmonies. So the first one's really simple. It's tonal or monochromatic. It's one color in its mid-tone and its lightest pastel, or it could be, it's the range of that one original color. So here's an example of a quilt artist who only used green, and she has 4 tones of similar green. This one I really like. She used her red, and then she used her mid-tone, which became mid-tone pink, and then she has her pastel pink. And she also has prints in here, but this works very well, and this would be a quilt that would be tonal. Now this one is self-explanatory. It's all just blues, and it's just 4 shades of blue, from the deepest jewel tone blue, your mid-tone blue, then a lighter blue, another lighter blue, and your pastel blue. Analogous. Analogous colors are colors that are adjacent to each other on the color wheel. And we tend to use them usually 3, 4 the max. So we can do orange, yellow, orange, and yellow, or we can do purple, blue, and aqua. So any color that's adjacent to the next color would be an analogous color. So this quilter not only did analogous, but also did tonal. So you can see she has the circle. She has the yellow orange, the red, the red. And then she has the stripes that are tonal, so she has the light blue, the mid-tone blue, the medium blue, the dark blue. So she got both. Here's another one, also similar. We skipped a color, but it's analogous. She has yellow, green, aqua blue. Some color wheels have more colors, some have less, but in general, this would be analogous as well. A triad. Any 3 colors evenly spaced on the color wheel. So you just pick a color, count 3, next color you'll use. Count 3, next color you use. This color wheel has 12 colors, so you won't have you'll have evenly spaced colors. So it's any 3 evenly spaced colors on the color wheel. And here's somebody, she just used red, pretty much close enough, red, yellow, and blue. She also mixed the midtones. She has a little green in there, but it generally works. Now, Erin Wilson uses a very, very, very unusual color palette. But she does pick the odd color on the color wheel, counts over, and she also uses the midtones as well as the pastels. So these colors are really bizarre, but they all work together. So if you look her up, you'll see that she really mixes from the deepest bright colors, she hits with the midtones, she mixes those pastels, but she tends to keep the same family of color. I know that's hard to understand, but if you look at this one, you can see where her purple, and then she has the pastel purple, and her blue, you can see where the colors came from. But she has a very unusual color palette, but when she puts it all together, it works very well together. A split complementary. So that's when you use one primary color with the adjacent complementary colors. So here you can see my primary color is the green, and I go across and I split, and I use the red, orange, and the magenta as a split complementary. So think of that as like a dial. So if I move that over to the blue, my split complementary would be the red, orange, and the yellow, orange. Or if I used my yellow as my primary, my split complementary would be violet and purple. A rectangle or tetradic, I can never pronounce it, is just 4 colors using all split complementary colors. So if you were to move this to the other complementary colors, you can just move your rectangle. A square, same thing. These are 4 colors that are evenly spaced on your color wheel. So here we have red, yellow, orange, green, and purple, and they'll all work together. And these also apply to your midtones and your pastels. And that pretty much sums up basic color theory. So I would suggest that you can go online and print out a color wheel. There are apps on for phones that you can look at it. But if you're ever stuck, just think of the complementary, the opposite colors, or you need to pick colors. Any color that's adjacent on the color will always work. Have fun with it. So that's basically how we make color harmonies in the fabric world.